The year is 1470. High in the mountains of Thessaly, far from any road that matters and any army that might arrive in time, the convent of St. Catherine stands alone, stone against stone, faith against time. At dawn, a bell rings across the valley, slow, deliberate, familiar. It has rung every morning for more than a century. Today, it rings for the last time. The sound rolls outward, fades into the hills, and is swallowed by a silence that will never again be broken by its voice. Inside the convent walls, 23 women kneel on cold stone. Their lips move in perfect unison, forming prayers so well known they no longer require thought. Words learned in youth, repeated through winters, plagues, and wars. But this morning, the words do not settle easily. They taste of ash, of endings, of something about to be taken that will never be returned. Beyond the walls, the horizon glows red. Not with sunrise, but with banners. The banners of the Ottoman Empire, an empire that does not arrive with hesitation or doubt, but flows forward like a tide, consuming kingdoms as if they were sand. It has already swallowed cities older than memory. Now it has reached this hill. Abbess Ilani stands among her sisters, her fingers wrapped tightly around a silver crucifix worn smooth by generations of hands before hers. It has survived wars, migrations, and emperors. Her hands tremble, but not from fear, from certainty. She knows what is coming. All of them do. In some quiet place they do not name. What they cannot imagine is that death, swift and final, would have been mercy. What happens next is not something most people were ever meant to know. It does not live in the history books studied in school. It was buried, erased, intentionally forgotten. Only fragments remain: letters, ledgers, testimonies locked away in archives where no one was expected to look. Only now are those fragments beginning to surface. This story does not ask whether you can endure the truth. It asks whether you are willing to remember it. That is the work of crimson historians. To recover voices power tried to silence, to turn attention into remembrance, and remembrance into resistance against forgetting. To understand the fate of these women, we must step back 17 years to 1453. Constantinople has fallen after 53 days of cannon fire. Hagia Sophia is stripped of its crosses. Its bells are melted down, its hymns replaced. Sultan Mehmed II understands something few conquerors ever do. You do not defeat a people by killing them. You defeat them by erasing who they were. And as long as these women pray in Latin, the old world still breathes. The fall of Constantinople did not end with the city's walls. It sent ripples outward, westward, into the fractured remains of the Byzantine world, where faith still lingered in stone and sound. From his new capital, Sultan Mehmed II looked beyond the conquered city and saw what others might have dismissed as harmless remnants. A bell still ringing at dawn, a monastery still standing on a hillside, a cross still casting its shadow on conquered soil. To him, these were not relics. They were refusals. Each one declared that conquest was incomplete, that identity had survived where armies had passed through. The women who continued to pray in Latin embodied this defiance. They carried no weapons, raised no banners, and commanded no followers. Yet their endurance was more dangerous than open rebellion. Soldiers can be defeated, revolts can be crushed, but a faith that survives quietly, generation after generation, threatens the permanence of empire itself. Mehmed's response was not impulsive, it was precise. He understood a truth learned through centuries of conquest. Massacre creates martyrs, and martyrs create memory. Songs are written. Stories spread. The dead become symbols that outlive the living. An empire that spills blood indiscriminately plants the seeds of its own resistance. So the Ottomans refined a more elegant solution. They did not aim to destroy bodies, but to dissolve identities. Not annihilation, but erasure. Communities would not be slaughtered. They would be absorbed, reshaped, or quietly removed from record. No saints would emerge, no heroes would be named. There would be nothing to remember, only silence. This method had already been tested across the empire. Greek monasteries were offered protection in exchange for conversion. Serbian convents were emptied and abandoned. Armenian churches were repurposed or allowed to decay. The pattern never varied. First came the offer: safety, continuity, survival, at the price of forgetting who you were. Then came the silence. Entire communities vanished without fire or spectacle, leaving behind no ruins dramatic enough to demand remembrance. The convent of St. Catherine, perched high in the mountains of Thessaly, far from garrisons or allies, became another quiet experiment. The women inside were not prepared for war. Their lives were shaped by prayer, fasting, and obedience. Their weapons were rosaries. Their armor was faith. Abbess Elani had guided the convent for 12 years. Before that, she had tended the sick in a village, later erased by plague. Sister Magdalena was only 19, newly professed, her hands still bearing the marks of farm labor. She sought refuge after her family was killed in a raid. Sister Theodorus, 70 years old, had outlived emperors and wars alike, and no longer feared death. What this story reveals what power fears most is not violent resistance, but memory. Under absolute rule, the most dangerous act is not rebellion. It is the refusal to forget who you are. What followed was not immediate slaughter, it was demonstration. A lesson delivered in stone and sound. The first cannonball did not strike the chapel itself. It struck the bell tower. Iron screamed as stone shattered, and the bell, mid-swing, mid-prayer, split apart in the air. Its fragments rained down into the herb garden below, crushing the plants the sisters had grown for healing. The same hands that once harvested rosemary and sage now flew to trembling mouths. The bell that had ordered their days, marked their hours, and called them to prayer for 140 years was silenced in a single breath. Abbess Elani did not cry out. She stepped forward into the dust, lifted her crucifix high, and began to sing, Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. Her voice was steady. One by one, the others joined her 23 voices rising together, thin and fragile, yet unbroken, cutting through the thunder of artillery like a final refusal. Empires do not pause for songs, but for a moment, the air held them. By midday, the gates gave way. Ottoman soldiers poured into the courtyard not with swords raised, but with ledgers under their arms, inkpots clinking at their belts, quills already stained. They moved through the convent like clerks, not conquerors. They counted rooms, counted bodies, recorded ages, conditions, usefulness. In their eyes, the women ceased to be souls. They became entries. A translator stepped forward, a Greek man whose accent betrayed the hills he had once called home. His voice shook as he read from the scroll. By order of Sultan Mehmed II, subjects of the conquered lands would be offered mercy through submission. Conversion meant protection. Refusal meant consequences. Abbess Elani stepped forward. She spoke calmly, not to the soldiers, but to the man forced to give their words voice. Tell your sultan that we have already given our lives to a king. We have nothing left to surrender. Hassan Pasha, the commanding officer, did not answer with anger. He smiled. He had learned that force was unnecessary when patience would suffice. That night, the women were locked inside their own chapel. No food, no water, no light. Outside, soldiers laughed, ate, and drank. Inside, silence pressed down like weight. Two younger sisters began to weep softly in the corner. Then Sister Magdalena, barely 20, began to whisper a psalm. Another voice joined. Then another. Slowly, the weeping faded. What the Ottomans did not understand was this. Deprivation was not new to these women. Neither was hunger. Neither was silence. They had trained their bodies for obedience and their spirits for endurance long before empire arrived. Hassan Pasha had seen faith like this before. In letters to the Sultan, he once wrote that belief burns brightest just before it dies. Now, He intended to find out whether that was true. If hunger had been meant to break them, it was time to try temptation instead. On the second day, the chapel doors opened. A servant entered quietly and set down bread and clean water, real food, untouched, deliberately placed within reach. It was not an act of mercy. It was an invitation. The women stared at it in silence, throats burning, bodies hollowed by thirst. The younger sisters glanced toward Abbess Elani, their eyes clouded with need. Before Elani could speak, Sister Theodoris, 70 years old, her voice thin but steady, understood the intention at once. To accept would be to soften. Elani nodded. They turned away. They fasted. By the third day, their lips were split and bleeding. Hands shook as they prayed. Some could no longer stand without support. Still, no one spoke the words demanded of them. Hassan Pasha watched from the courtyard, impressed despite himself, irritation tightening his jaw. At last, he entered the chapel. He offered them a final choice: conversion and protection, or a journey to Constantinople, a road long enough to kill the weak. He did not threaten them. He promised. Elani looked at her sisters, many barely conscious, and answered with a single sentence. They would walk. That night, there were no speeches. The women gathered in the darkness, holding one another for warmth and strength. Magdalena began to hum a hymn, so softly it barely disturbed the air. One by one, the others joined her. Outside, a few soldiers paused to listen. One would remember the sound years later and tell it to his grandson. The story would not survive. At dawn, 23 women began the march south, hands bound, no horses, no carts. The road became the sentence. On the second day, Sister Irene collapsed. Younger sisters carried her for miles until she died that night. They buried her with bare hands. Hassan recorded the count: 22. On the fourth day, Sister Callista sat down and did not rise again. When they reached the port of Volos 7 days later, only 18 remained. But they did not weep. Their silence was no longer grief. It was resolve. By the 7th morning, the road had done what hunger and exhaustion could not. Now, Hassan Pasha moved to the final stage. Abbess Elani was summoned alone to his tent. What happened there does not appear in Ottoman records. It survives only in a Venetian merchant's letter, written years later by a man who witnessed the aftermath. At dawn, they brought her back. She could not walk. Her eyes were open, but empty, as though something essential had been taken and never returned. They dressed her in silk and presented her to the camp as a convert, a victory made visible. But when the merchant passed close, he saw her lips moving. She was still praying in Latin. This was the empire's triumph. Not martyrs, whose deaths would be sung and remembered, but ghosts' bodies that lived on, emptied of self. Elani walked with the others from that day forward, but she never spoke again, never met another's eyes. She was present, yet absent, a warning shaped like a woman. At the port of Volos, the remaining nuns were chained to the benches of a war galley. A ship's manifest recorded them, not by name, but as property: religious captives, female domestic service, and conversion. The voyage lasted 12 days. Storms battered the deck. Sickness spread through the hold. At night, Sister Magdalena whispered psalms. Other captives turned their heads to listen. When Constantinople rose from the sea, it gleamed like a blade. They were marched through the city and forced to kneel beneath the call to prayer near Hagia Sophia. One sister whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Then they were taken below the palace, down into darkness, into a place that officially did not exist. What awaited them beneath the palace was not a cell, but erasure made architectural. Below Topkapi Palace stretched a network of tunnels, few maps acknowledged, and no official records named. These were servant passages, storage corridors, forgotten veins running through the bedrock spaces, designed for movement without memory. It was here, beneath the heart of empire, that the remaining nuns disappeared from sight. Not imprisoned in chains, but buried alive beneath silence. Centuries later, in 2011, during restoration work meant only to stabilize crumbling stone, archaeologists broke through a false wall at the far edge of the palace foundations. What they found stopped the work entirely. Scratched into the stone were dozens of crude crosses, uneven, shallow, desperate. They were not decorative. They were not symbolic flourishes. They were made by hands with no tools, no time, and no expectation of being seen. Beneath them, etched so faintly it could be missed at a glance, were 4 Latin words, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. This was their chapel. By day, the women lived as shadows. They scrubbed palace floors they would never walk freely upon. They carried water for rooms they would never enter. They tended fires that warmed others while their own bodies shivered. They spoke only when spoken to, and often not even then. In the records, if they appeared at all, they were numbers, tasks, labor. By night, when the palace slept and footsteps faded, they gathered in the hidden room. There was no priest to lead them, no Bible to read from. There was only memory. Psalms were recited from recall. Verses reshaped by necessity, held together by repetition rather than ink. Communion was shared with bread stolen from palace kitchens and water drawn from the same wells that fed the Sultan's fountains. Their faith was not proclaimed. It was carved. They used fingernails, broken pottery, anything sharp enough to mark stone. Each cross took time. Each line was an act of defiance, measured in pain. Among the markings, archaeologists found one that stood apart. A small bird, scratched into the corner of the wall. Beside it, 23 lines, one for each sister who had begun the journey from Thessaly. Only 11 were completed. The rest trailed off, unfinished, as if interrupted mid-prayer. The bird belonged to Sister Magdalena. It was her voice, left behind when her own might one day be taken. There had always been rumors. In 1478, a Venetian prisoner held for ransom wrote of strange sounds echoing beneath the harem, women singing softly in Latin to a god not recognized by the empire. For centuries, historians dismissed it as superstition, the fantasy of an exhausted captive, until the wall was opened, and the stone answered back. What follows next is not marked by a date, but by absence. At some point, the carvings change. The careful crosses give way to harsher lines, cut deeper into the stone as if driven by urgency rather than ritual. The marks lose their symmetry. They overlap. Some are struck twice, others abandoned halfway through. The hands that carved them were no longer steady. They were tired, hungry, afraid, and still, they carved. Until one night, they did not. The wall ends in silence. Ottoman records from 1482 offer only a single clue. A brief entry notes a cleansing of palace staff under the new sultan. No explanation follows. No names are listed. No locations recorded. Only one word appears beside the entry, written in neat, efficient script: disposed. With that, the women vanish from official history. No graves, no trials, no witnesses meant to remember them. And yet, the stone refuses to agree with the ledger. When archaeologists examined the hidden chapel more closely, they found traces that did not belong to the palace. Wax residue embedded in the floor, mixed with herbs unfamiliar to Ottoman candles. The composition matched convent recipes formulas passed down among nuns for centuries. This meant the vigil did not end quickly. These women did not disappear all at once. They endured. For months, perhaps for years. Night after night, long after hope should have failed, they gathered in the dark to pray, to whisper, to carve. Each mark on the wall was an act of resistance measured not in violence, but in persistence. Each cross declared, "We are still here." Each night they survived was a small defeat for an empire built on erasure. The final mark on the wall is not a cross. It is the bird. Sister Magdalena's symbol appears once more, carved faintly, as if the hand that made it lacked strength. Beside it are two words, written in Greek so lightly they almost vanish into the stone. We endure. Not we will survive, not we will return. Only this endurance, presence, refusal. Nothing follows, no more scratches, no more symbols. The wall falls silent, as history intended it to. The Ottoman Empire would last nearly 6 centuries. It would conquer continents, command armies, and rewrite maps. Its sultans would be remembered, its palaces preserved, its victories taught. But in the end, what remains of these women is not a monument or a record. It is a wall marked by fingernails, a prayer carved where no one was supposed to look. Proof that even when power succeeds in silencing voices, it cannot always erase the marks they leave behind. And this is where the story must be allowed to step beyond its own walls. What happened to the nuns of Street Catherine is not, in the end, a story about theology, nor is it an indictment of one empire alone. It is about power, how it behaves when it believes itself absolute, and what it does when it encounters people it cannot fully control. Empires do not fear armies as much as they fear persistence. They do not fear noise as much as they fear memory. What the Ottomans attempted here was not simply domination, but disappearance. The careful removal of people from the world without leaving behind anything that could be held, sung, or passed on. The women did not win in any way history usually recognizes. They did not reclaim their convent. They did not overthrow their captors. They did not escape into legend. There are no statues of them, no feast days, no hymns bearing their names. By the standards of power, they failed completely. And yet, they left proof. Proof that erasure is never as clean as it pretends to be. Proof that even when bodies are controlled, counted, and disposed of, identity can still find a place to hide. The scratches in the stone beneath the palace were not acts of defiance meant to be seen. They were not messages to the future. They were something quieter and far more dangerous. Refusals made without witnesses. Acts of memory performed with no expectation of reward. That is what power misunderstands. It believes resistance must announce itself to matter. It believes silence equals surrender. But silence can also be discipline, waiting, survival. The nuns did not preserve their faith in grand declarations, but in repetition, in prayer recalled from memory, in bread shared secretly, in a bird carved into stone by a hand that knew it might not last another night. History, as we are taught it, records victories. It keeps track of dates, treaties, borders, and rulers. It tells us who conquered whom, and when. But memory works differently. Memory is not interested in triumph. It concerns itself with endurance, with what remains after power has finished speaking. History is written by victors. That much is true. But memory belongs to those who survive long enough or leave enough behind to be remembered. And sometimes, survival looks like nothing more than a mark in the dark, waiting centuries for someone to notice it and understand what it means. And time, which power so often mistakes for an ally, did what armies and decrees eventually cannot. The Ottoman Empire endured for centuries, expanding, ruling, contracting, adapting until it did not. In 1922, it fell quietly into history. Its sultans became names in books. Its laws lost their force. The machinery that once catalogued lives and erased identities ground to a halt. What had been absolute power dissolved into dates and footnotes. The palace that had stood at the center of empire did not vanish. It changed its purpose. Topkapi became a museum. Today, tourists walk its halls with cameras in hand. They admire tiled walls, jeweled relics, sweeping views of the Bosphorus. They follow guided paths designed to tell a story of grandeur and governance. Above polished floors and curated displays, footsteps echo unaware of what lies beneath them. Few suspect that under those stones is a room never meant to be remembered. Fewer still know why it exists. but the crosses remain. Hidden behind a wall that once pretended nothing was there, the scratches still cut into stone, uneven, fragile, defiant. The words remain, too, faint but legible after 5 centuries. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness, not as metaphor, as record, as testimony, as contradiction to every ledger that tried to say these women were gone. That is the quiet irony power never anticipates. Empires are built to last. They plan for eternity. They carve their victories into monuments, meant to outlive generations. And yet, what survives them is often the smallest thing, the thing never meant to endure. A prayer whispered where no one listened. A symbol scratched where no one looked. A memory preserved not by permission, but by stubbornness. The nuns of Street Catherine walked forward into darkness without knowing if their faith would be seen, if their suffering would matter, or if their names would survive them. They did not carve those words for historians. They did not scratch crosses for tourists. They did it because refusing to disappear was the last freedom left to them. Centuries later, someone broke through a wall. Someone paused long enough to notice marks that should not have been there. Someone asked why. And now, you have followed that question to its end. These women believed without evidence, without reassurance, that someone, someday, would look back and understand what they had done. That belief carried them through hunger, chains, darkness, and silence. You just did. And in doing so, you proved them right. If you found this story thought-provoking, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. History is not only about what happened, but why it mattered. Follow for more stories that explore power, fear, and the human mind.